Hi guys, welcome to CADS 3053, module number 3. In last module, module 9, we learned how to average different markups applied on different merchandise items based on the proportions of the merchandise with varying markups. In this module, we are extending the average markup discussion to solve different buying or merchandising problems in buying scenarios. We're going to especially learn how we can utilize this AMU or average markup concept to balance markups for the remaining purchases a buyer needs to make given what's already been purchased. Before we get into the discussion of markups for balance, let's refresh our memory about the average markup setup as well as how to get to the average markup calculation. Remember this setup, when we try to solve problems for average markup given multiple groups of different merchandise that come with different markup percentages, we use this setup, right? We put the different groups of items on the far left column. We put quantity of each item group and unit cost, unit retail, and total cost, total retail, and markup percent. Okay. Like I said in last module, this setup is extremely important for buyers or merchandisers that when they plan for the remaining purchases and understand how much average markup they have achieved so far and what has to be achieved in the remaining purchases given the average markup goal in all these scenarios. So we are going to take a look at how this setup is utilized to solve different markup balancing problems in buying or merchandising situations. Here we are learning new concepts of retail balance and cost balance. The retail balance basically means the retail value of the remaining purchase that we need to make, which is what we call balance. Okay? And cost balance evidently means the cost value of the remaining purchase that we need to make. Okay, the cost value of the balance. Okay. The remaining purchase basically kind of assumes that we have a total of purchases that we want to make, and probably we have already purchased some today so far. Okay, so based on what we need for total cost and total retail, and what we already have to date, so cost dollar or retail dollar to date. Okay, given these pieces of information, how can we calculate the cost balance and the retail balance? Okay, let's think about it. Okay, given what we learned about this setup, that we're seeing the quantity, unit cost, unit retail, total cost, total retail, markup percent, this setup, and the AMU percent, the calculation, what's AMU and how it's calculated. Okay, given the knowledge of these, okay, how can we calculate the cost dollar or cost value of the balance and the retail value of the balance? Easily speaking, the cost dollar balance or cost value of the balance will be the difference between the total cost of the total merchandise and the cost dollar to date, right? If you think about it, although the cost of the merchandise that we have purchased so far plus the cost of the merchandise that we need to buy more, which is the balance, that will be our total cost for the total merchandise, right? Given that idea, the cost balance will be total cost minus cost to date, right? The same logic applies to the calculation of retail balance dollar. So retail balance will be total retail minus retail to date. Right? Out of the total retail value of the total merchandise that we need to purchase, if you subtract the retail value of the merchandise that we have purchased so far to date, okay, what's left will be the retail dollar for the balance, the remaining purchases that we're going to make, right? So given the concept of the cost balance and retail balance, let's try to work on this one problem, okay? Let's say we are planning to sell 1,500 sweaters, retailing at $40 each. So that $40 will be the unit retail price of each of the 1,500 sweaters, okay, in a December promotion. And we have a markup goal of 48.5%. Okay, that markup goal would indicate the AMU percent, right? So the total, the AMU percent for the total merchandise would be 48.5%. Okay. We've already made one purchase of 1,200 sweaters. Okay, so that's the purchase to date. Okay, costing $23 each. That $23 will be the unit cost of each of those 1,200 sweaters that we already purchased. Okay, in order to meet your markup goal of the 48.5%, okay, what would be the maximum cost that we can pay for the remaining units? Okay, so that is asking the cost for the balance, cost balance. Okay, and the second question is, what is the retail value for the remaining units? That is asking the retail value for the remaining balance. So retail balance. Okay, so question number one is asking cost balance. The second one is asking the retail balance. Okay, let's utilize the setup that we are seeing here and plug in all the numbers that we already know that's given in the problem. And then let's think, how can we actually solve for the two problems, the cost balance and retail balance, based on that. Let's pause the video here for a little while you guys are thinking about and working on this problem. Okay, so let's plug in the given numbers first. Okay, so we've got the purchase that we already made, purchase 1, and we need to figure out the balance, knowing the total, right? About the total, we know that the total units has to be 1,500 units. So that's quantity for the total would be 1,500. And for total, the AMU percent should be 48.5%. That was our markup goal. So we can plug that number in under AMU percent for total, that's cell. Then we know something about the first purchase that we already made. Well, we bought 1,200 units. Okay, and each unit costed us $23, and we have to retail these units for $40 each, and the same unit retail is going to be applied to the balance as well, because that's what they said. All 1,500 units are going to be sold for $40 at retail. Okay, the question mark, what were asked in the question were the two things, the cost balance and the retail balance, where the question marks are at. Okay, so let's first try to answer the cost balance first. Cost dollar for the balance. Okay, for us to be able to calculate that, we need to know the total cost for the total merchandise as well as the total cost for the first purchase. Okay, those two numbers, because cost dollar for balance will be total cost for total minus the total cost for the purchases that were made to date, right? We can calculate total cost for the first purchase or purchase to date by knowing that so far we have purchased 1,200 units and the unit cost of $23 was paid. So you just multiply the quantity by unit cost. That will be 27,600. That's the cost dollar for purchase 1. Next, we want to calculate the total cost for total, but we don't have any unit cost for the total, so we can't calculate it directly from the quantity and unit cost. But now let's take a look at the retail side. The unit retail is $40 for the total, the merchandise, and we know that it's 1,500 units for the entire merchandise. So that would be, we can calculate the total retail value of the total merchandise by knowing the quantity of 1,500 and the unit retail of $40. So $40 times 1,500 will be $60,000. So total retail being $60,000 and the markup percent being 48.5%. Given these two numbers, we can calculate total cost. How do we calculate total cost from total retail and markup percent? Now this becomes the case where we know the retail and markup and we're supposed to calculate cost, right? The RCM relationship that we learned before, and one of the three most important, most frequently used cases I mentioned many times before. So when we know the R and markup percent, how do we calculate cost? That will be cost equals R retail times 100% minus markup. So let's apply this logic here. So the total cost for the total merchandise will be the retail of $60,000 times 100% minus 48.5% markup. It will be $30,900 for the total cost of the total. Now we can calculate cost balance, which was the question mark that we were supposed to reach. That's the total cost for the total minus the total cost for the purchase one. So $30,900 minus $27,600, that would lead to $3,300 for cost balance. That basically means that we have to spend, or we can't spend, $3,300 more at cost to purchase more merchandise. So now let's try to calculate the retail balance, retail dollar for the balance. Okay, since we already know the total retail for total as a $60,000, we can calculate the retail for balance if we know the total retail for purchase one, right? Which we can calculate easily here. Since for purchase one we have 1,200 units for the unit retail of $40. So 1,200 times $40 will be $48,000 for the total retail value of purchase one. Okay. Now, given the total retail value of purchase one and total retail of the total, okay, we can find the total retail for the balance, the retail balance, from the difference between these two numbers. So the retail balance dollar will be $60,000 minus $48,000, which comes up to $12,000. So $12,000 for the retail balance and $3,300 for the cost balance. We answered the question. So now that we learned how to calculate the cost value and retail value of the balance of the purchase that we need to make, we sometimes may also want to calculate the markup percent we need to achieve for the balance of merchandise that we need to purchase. Okay? Well, remember that markup percent is retail minus cost over retail, and we know the cost and retail value of the balance, and we can easily imagine that markup percent for the balance will be retail balance dollar minus cost balance dollar over retail balance dollar. Rather than trying to memorize this as a formula, markup percent for balance formula, just kind of try to remember markup percent is always retail minus cost over retail. Okay? In a given problem, when you see any retail and cost value, you can instantly think that, okay, then now I can calculate markup percent based on this. So that any combination of RCM utilize one of those three most frequently used important formulas that I have talked about many times. Okay, this is the case where I know the R and C and I'm supposed to calculate markup percent. Okay, we'll see how this is applied in the next problem. Okay, so revisiting the practice problem, the first practice problem we've just looked at. What if the question was asking what markup percent the buyer needs to achieve for the remaining units for the balance? Given all the information that we already have calculated or known, okay, markup percent for the balance can be easily calculated. Okay, now we know that total retail for the balance and retail the cost for the balance numbers, and given these two numbers, R and C are known, and from which we need to easily calculate the markup percent. The markup percent for the balance will be basically where the question mark is at, and so the question mark will be answered as $12,000 minus $3,300 over $12,000, R minus C over R, and that leads to the markup of 72.5%, and that will be the markup percent for the balance. So we're learning another term here called average retail price, or ARP. The ARP is nothing but the really the average retail price of any group of merchandise. So that means the total retail dollar of that group of merchandise divided by the number of units or number of items that exist in that group of merchandise. And you can calculate ARP for any group of merchandise. You can calculate ARP for the balance, ARP for the total merchandise, or ARP for the purchase to date, any group of merchandise that you're looking at, as long as you know the total retail value of that group, and as long as you know how many units that exist in that group of merchandise, you will be able to calculate ARP. Okay. For example, in the previous problem that we looked at, the total retail for the total merchandise was $60,000, and the number of items were 1,500 units. So that leads to the ARP of $40. We already knew that ARP was $40 from the given problem because the problem said that all items, all 1,500 sweaters are going to be retailed for $40. But even if we didn't know that information, as long as we know the total retail is $60,000, and then we have 1,500 units, we should be able to calculate the ARP, the average retail price, for 1,500 sweaters by knowing those two pieces of information through this calculation. Not only the average retail price, but also sometimes we want to calculate average unit cost as well. Just like average retail price, average cost per unit will be calculate by dividing the total cost value of the group of merchandise and divide that by the total number of items, number of units that group of merchandise has. We can calculate average cost per unit for any group of merchandise, just in the same manner as we calculate the ARP for any group of merchandise. For example, if we were asked to calculate the average unit cost for all sweaters in the previous problem we looked at, and we can also think about the total cost of the total sweater, 1,500 sweaters, which was given as $30,900, and the number of items in the total sweater purchase, which was 1,500 units. So that 30,900 divided by 1,500 will be $20.60. Okay, we can that was the average cost per unit, average unit cost for the total merchandise, the 1,500 sweaters. What if the question is asking how much is the average unit cost for the remaining sweaters to purchase? So the balance in the practice problem 1, the previous problem. So if it was just asking the average unit cost for the balance instead of the entire 1,500 sweaters, then what would be the answer? Let's think about it. Let's pause the video here for a second. Okay, so the total cost of the balance or cost balance that we calculated was $3,300. And we know that we need to purchase 300 units more because the total number of units of sweaters that we need for this promotion is 1,500, and we've already purchased 1,200 from the purchase 1. So we will need to buy 300 more units. Okay, so that gives us the average cost per unit or average unit cost for the balance to be $11, 3,300 divided by 300. So walking through all the problems that we have taken a look at, including cost balance, retail balance, market percent for the balance, and ARP, and average cost per unit, and all these things combined, we filled almost all of the cells in this grid except for one, which is the markup percent for purchase 1, the purchase that has been made so far. We can also easily calculate this markup percent, right? Because we know the retail value and cost value of this purchase. We can calculate markup percent from those retail and cost value. You can either utilize the unit cost and unit retail, or the total cost and total retail. Whichever set you use, you will get the same markup percent. So it could be the 40 minus 23 over 40, R minus C over R, or do the total retail minus total cost over total retail. So that's $48,000 minus 27 $1,600, divide that by $48,000. Either way, we will get the same markup percent, which is 42.5%. So now that we've got all numbers in this grid, let's evaluate and review this situation. Okay, if you were the buyer, the sweater buyer, for this promotion, you had to have 1,500 sweaters. That was the setup, and you had to achieve 48.5% markup goal. Okay, you've already made the purchase of 1,200 units at the unit cost of $23, and that was 42.5% markup. Okay, so now you are in a situation where you need to achieve 72.5% markup. Okay, you can only pay $11 per unit, okay, to the vendor to buy these 300 units of sweaters. Okay, because you purchased so many of the low markup sweaters from the first purchase, to be able to meet your markup goal of 48.5%, now you have to really look carefully to find a really low cost sweaters, 300 units of them, that you can pay only $11 per each sweater, for you to be able to meet the markup goal. This is not a really good situation for the buyer. Probably the first purchase was a little bit too reckless. Alright, so let's work on another practice problem. Okay, a very similar setup that we're going to think about the cost balance, retail balance, markup percent for balance, ARP, and average cost per unit, all the things that we learned, those terminologies that we have learned so far, and the concepts to solve this problem. Okay, the men's pants buyer, Mr. Brown, needs merchandise worth $12,000 at retail for the Labor Day sales. So it looks like $12,000 at retail value is all this buyer needs for these sales. Okay, so that $12,000 will become your total retail budget for the total merchandise. Okay, he will purchase this merchandise from 3 vendors. Okay, his average markup goal for this purchase is 53%. So now we have the average markup goal. Okay, from the first vendor, he purchased 50 pants for $27 each at cost. Okay, with a markup of 55%. So we've got the quantity and unit cost and markup for the first vendor's merchandise. Then from the second vendor, he purchased 70 pleated front pants for the total retail value of $3,500 with a markup of 50%. So we've got the quantity of 70 pants and the total retail value of the second vendor's purchase. So that will be not unit retail, but total retail of for the second vendor's the purchase from the second vendor. Finally, the buyer will be visiting the last vendor, from which he will purchase 100 pleated slider pants. So 100 more pants to buy for the balance. In order to meet the average markup goal, which was 53% given above, 2 questions. What's the average unit cost Mr. Brown can pay to the last vendor? So that's kind of asking the average cost per unit for the balance. Okay, what's the markup percent he needs to achieve from the purchase from the last vendor? Again, it's markup percent for the balance that I asked. As I mentioned earlier, the best way to solve this type of problem when you have a markup goal and trying to figure things out for the balance, the best way to answer these questions without getting so confused, okay, would be to set up this type of grid. Okay, so this time we have 3 vendors, and the third vendor is kind of considered as the balance. We haven't purchased anything from the third vendor yet, but we've got a plan. Okay, so given the problem, all the information that's given in the problem, let's first try to plug in the numbers that are already given into this grid. Okay, let's pause the video here and work on plugging in the numbers and see if you got them right. Okay, well, the reason why I asked you to plug in the given numbers first before you actually go ahead and answer the question is because interpretation of the question instead of the problem itself is absolutely important. That is if you could put down the numbers in the right cells in the grid, that solves half of the problem already right there. But if you put the number in the wrong spot, then that no matter how well you do in the calculation, you're not going to get the right answer. So that's why it's important for us to check whether we understood the question or the problem, the setup, the scenario correctly here. So let's see here. Okay, from the first vendor, he purchased 50 pans at the unit cost of 27 with the markup percent of 55. So that was the first vendor's purchase. The purchase from the second vendor was 70 pans with the total retail value of 3,500 with a 50% markup. Okay, those three pieces of information were given. Okay, from the last vendor, the only thing we know is that we are going to have to buy 100 pans from the last vendor, right? But we don't know anything else about the last vendor's purchase. In total, the labor sale purchase will have to be $12,000 at the total retail value, and the average markup goal should be 53%. So we have to meet the 53% markup goal. Okay. The two questions that were asked were, the first question was asking what was the average cost that the buyer can pay to the last vendor. So that is the average cost per unit for vendor 3. So that's where the question mark went to, the unit cost of vendor 3. The second question was asking what is the markup percent the buyer has to achieve from the last vendor. So that basically asks the markup percent for the balance. Okay, so the question mark goes to the markup percent for the vendor 3 or the balance. Now, knowing where the question marks are, okay, and where all the given information has to be put in this grid, okay, let's try to walk through these problems so that we can answer those two question marks. Okay, the best way for us to get to that question marks would be taking a look at each row one by one. So try to see vendor 1 row first. Okay, given the pieces of information that we already have, can we figure out the rest of the remaining cells that are blank right now? Okay, think about it that way, and then take a look at the vendor 2 row. Okay, and then vendor 3's and the total. Okay. Once you go through each row one by one, okay, and try to answer, fill out any of the cells that are remaining blank based on what's known from in the other cells in the same row. Okay, do that for every row, and then take a look at the grid column by column. So each column one by one, doing the same thing. Try to utilize the information in the other cells in that column to solve for the empty cells in that column. Okay, try to do that. So row by row first, and then column by column. Okay, once you do that, you may fill a lot of the cells, but you may not be able to complete all cells. In that case, go back to the row by row thing again. Okay, so if you go through this row by row and column by column and row by row, column by column, maybe twice, there you will be able to solve almost all questions, which means you can answer any questions related to any of the cells that are in this setup. And that's usually the case for a lot of other merchandise or buying problems, especially when we try to figure out a lot of information regarding what's left, the remaining balance purchase. So let's utilize this advice and try to answer those two question marks by taking a look at these rows, each row at a time, and then each column at a time, and then each row at a time in that order. Okay, so given my advice earlier, let's take a look at the first row, vendor 1. Okay, what do we know about vendor 1 already? The purchase from vendor 1, we know the quantity and the unit cost and markup percent. We know a lot of things, right? From the quantity and unit cost, we can easily calculate total cost. That would be the first step. So total cost was 1,350. 50 times 27 equals 1,350. Okay. Now that we know the total cost of vendor 1's purchase, the purchase from vendor 1, okay, can we also figure out some other sales in the same row, vendor 1 row? Yes, we can next figure out the total retail value of vendor 1. How do we do that? That's nothing but the case where we know the cost value and market percent, and we're trying to figure out retail value from it, from the cost and market percent, right? So retail equals cost divided by 100% minus market percent. Very familiar? Yes, it's one of the 3 most important formulas I said many times, right? So that will be 1,350 cost divided by 100% minus 55% markup. Okay, that will lead to the retail value of $3,000. So we got that one figured out. Okay. Now that we know the total retail value of vendor 1, can we also figure out another cell, the empty cell in that row? Yes, the unit retail can be figured out too. How? Right? Knowing the total retail and the quantity, it is nothing but the case we have to calculate the ARP, or average unit retail price, for then the purchase from vendor 1, right? So total retail $3,000 divided by the number of units, 50, equals $60. There. So we figured out all the numbers in the first row, the vendor 1 row. Okay. Now we are moving on to the second row, vendor 2. For vendor 2, we know the number of units, the quantity, as well as the total retail and market percent. Okay. Again, we can figure out the total cost from the total retail and market percent, right? How do we do that? That's right. This is also becoming one of the 3 most frequently used formulas, right? When we know the R, total R, and market percent, we can figure out the C, total cost, right? So R times 100% minus market percent will be the C, right? Cost value. So 3,500 times 100% minus 50% will be 1,750. It's the total cost. Now that we know the both total cost and total retail of vendor 2, can we also figure out the remaining sales for vendor 2? Yes, from total cost and total retail and the quantity, we can figure out the unit cost and unit retail. Right, so that would be the total cost and total retail for vendor 2 divided by the quantity, 70, right? So that's 25 for the unit cost and 50 for the unit retail. That 25 will be the average cost per unit for the purchase from vendor 2, and then 50 will be the ARP, average retail price, for the purchase of from the vendor, the second vendor, right? Okay, now we're done with the second vendor's row. Now moving on to the next row, vendor 3 row. That row, we know only one piece of information, which is the quantity, right? But we don't have enough information for us to be able to figure out the rest of the cell based on just this 100, the quantity. So we're going to have to skip this row and move on to the total row. In the total row, we know 2 pieces of information, the total retail value of the total merchandise, as well as the market percent for the total merchandise. So given these 2, we can also figure out the total cost value of the total merchandise, right? This is the same case as the previous case. So RCM relationship, again, remember RCM relationship. So how do we calculate total cost for total merchandise here? Just like what we did earlier, it will be cost equals retail times 100% minus market percent, right? So the total cost for the total merchandise will be equal to $12,000 times 100% minus 53%, and that will be $5,640 of total cost. Okay. Now that we know the total cost and total retail, can we figure out the rest of the sales? Probably not yet, because we don't know the quantity yet just by looking at the numbers in the row. But if we go for the column by column, which is the next stage, next step, we may be able to figure out the rest as well. So let's go by the column by column case. Let's take a look at the first column first. Since we know the quantity for all three vendors, we can easily add them up to know the total quantity, right? 50 plus 70 plus 100 will lead to 220 units for the total merchandise. Okay. Next, let's take a look at the second column. We know all the first two vendors' unit cost, but we don't know the third vendor and the total, the average unit cost for those two rows. We can't do anything about them because we will have to go by row later on, so we're gonna just skip those. And the same goes for the unit retail one, and move on to the total cost and total retail column. Okay, since we know the vendor 1 and vendor 2's total cost as well as the total cost for the total merchandise, we can easily calculate the cost balance, right? Total cost value of the balance, which is the vendor 3 purchase, okay, by subtracting the vendor 1 and vendor 2's total cost from the total cost of the total merchandise. So that will be 5,640 minus 1,350 minus 1,750 equals $2,540 for the cost balance. Okay, now the retail balance. Okay, the total retail value of the third vendor. Okay, that's the same logic. 12,000 minus 3,000 minus 3,500. That will leave us with 5,500 retail value of the purchase from vendor 3 will have to be. Now that we have calculated the cost balance and retail balance, now we can also calculate the markup percent for the balance, right? So we're kind of moving from the column by column calculation to row by row calculation, kind of looking at the vendor 3 row. Okay, given the cost balance and retail balance we just calculated, okay, what would be the markup percent for the balance for vendor 3? Okay, that would be 5,500 minus 2,540 divided by 5,500. R minus C over R, so that will be 53.82%. Okay, we can take a look at the same row for the unit cost and unit retail column, right? So that since we know the total cost and total retail, we can easily calculate the unit cost and unit retail by knowing the quantity as well, right? So you divide the total cost and total retail by the quantity of vendor 3 merchandise, which is 100. Then the unit cost and unit retail can be easily calculated. So they would be 25.4 and 55 for the unit cost and unit retail for vendor 3. And we can do the same thing for the total merchandise to calculate the average unit cost and average retail price for the total merchandise. Since we know the total cost and total retail and the quantity of the total merchandise, we do the same kind of thing, dividing the total cost of retail by the quantity of the total merchandise will give us the unit cost and unit retail as they are given here. So we figured out everything. The question mark, now going back to the actual problem, what the problem asked, there were two things the problem asked. One was what would be the unit cost that the buyer can pay to the vendor 3. Okay, so what would be the answer? What was the average cost per unit that the buyer can pay? Okay, the answer would be 25.4, which is the unit cost of vendor 3, right? The other question that was asked was what was the markup percent that the buyer needs to achieve from the purchase from vendor 3, the last vendor. Again, that was the markup percent for the balance. The answer is, that's right, 53.82%, which we calculated for vendor 3. That would be the answer. So we can figure out almost anything given, as long as we know at least two things about the vendor, we can figure out the rest. In terms of the RCM, if we know either R or between R and C, if we know either one of them and markup, we can figure out the rest, that kind of thing. So remember that RCM relationship and those three important formulas that we have mentioned many times. You have to memorize them. You have to remember them for you to be able to solve these kind of questions and answer any kind of questions related to balancing markups for the remaining purchase that we need to make as a buyer. Of course we have to understand the concept of AMU percent and what's the concept of balance. Balance being what's remaining, right? Balance being the difference between the total that you need and what you already have purchased to date. And as long as you know those, the concept of balance and those three important formulas of the RCM relationship, then you should be able to answer almost any questions related to this type of problem. So just remember that if you are kind of stuck and are not sure what's the next step, what number to calculate next to be able to reach the final answer, because as we saw in this problem and the earlier problem, a lot of times the answer is not straightforward. You have to go through multiple steps of calculation to reach the final answer and things like that. It is really hard for you to keep your mind straight if you just not use this type of grid and just try to solve things one by one by yourself. It's pretty hard. So this kind of grid really helps. And if you were kind of struggling and stuck somewhere, remember, okay, this tip that I gave you before, try to solve each row one by one first, okay, and then take a look at each column one by one, and then revisit the rows one by one again if there are any empty cells in that row, okay, and do this a few times. Usually within the second time you're visiting that row or column, you should be able to answer and fill out all the cells in that row or column. I have not seen a case where you need to go there like even third time. So that's kind of my advice. Remember the three most important RCM relationship formulas. Okay. Remember the concept of balance being the difference between the total and what's already purchased to date. Okay. And remember, go through things row by row and then column by column and then row by row and then column by column again. Okay. As long as you do these things that I just mentioned, you should not be lost. Okay. Okay, so let me recap all about the markups that we've been talking about in the last few several modules. We started from basic markup, and then we talked about three different types of markup: initial markup, cumulative markup, and maintained markup. And now in the next couple of modules, we talked about average markup and how we utilize the average markup as a markup goal to balance markups and plans for the remaining purchase that we have to make and things like that. This markup, why do we have to care about the markup? And that's because markup is a direct factor determining the gross margin, and assuring good gross margin is the important part of the buyer's job, or the merchandiser's or the line planner's job. Utilizing these three types of markup calculations to make good decisions about the merchandise cost or the retail price for the customers, or the quantities of the merchandise to buy, and all these things are very important. As we just took a look at from a lot of problems of the balancing of markups, it is very important to have an ongoing analysis of the markups, how much markup that we have achieved so far through the purchases so far, and how much markup is needed to be achieved for the remaining purchases. And for us to be able to meet that markup goal, then what would be the cost that we can pay for the remaining purchases, and what retail value do we have to achieve from the remaining purchases, all those kind of things. You evaluate what's done in terms of the markup, and anticipate and plan for the future for what action should be taken for the remaining operation or purchases, the merchandising activities, is an absolutely important part of the merchandiser or the buyer's job. And also, knowing the initial markup as well as the maintained markup, performance of each vendor's merchandise will allow the buyer to determine who are the good vendors. We would like to continue to utilize vendors who give us good markups, right? Because the markups leads to our gross margin, which trickles down to our profit, which is our absolute ultimate goal to maximize profit. Alright, thank you for listening. This concludes Module 10 lecture. Alright, also don't forget to work on module problem assignment number 10. Alright, thanks for listening. Bye.